Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Laszlo Montgomery here. Thanks for tuning in to the China History Podcast. Singapore Part 2 this time. Last episode, I sort of wandered all over the place. So many names, kingdoms, rulers, legends, and whatnot. The history of pre-15th century Singapore isn't that well documented of a history, but I hope you got a sense of this region, and most of all, how all these watered lands had been linked by trade that went back to the discovery of the monsoon winds so many millennia ago. Singapura, or Temasek, was just a small part of a bigger story that saw the development of the major histories of modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia. Temasek, or Singapura, thrived during the 14th century, but all came crashing down in or around 1398. Then, as we saw, the Singapura ruler led his troops and followers up the Malay Coast to present-day Malacca, and thus began the history of the Malacca Sultanate. And then we closed things off last time with the Age of Exploration, or Age of Discovery, with the arrival of the Portuguese, keen to outflank the Venetian traders to get those Asian spices. Then came the fateful voyage, led by Alfonso de Albuquerque. In 1511, after Albuquerque's soldiers had put an end to the Sultanate and forced the political center to shift to Johor, and later on to Johor and Riau, located on the other side of the Malacca Strait, they did this by blockading the port, bottling the inhabitants up without food or provisions of any kind. Trade, the lifeblood of the Malacca Sultanate, was halted. And the Portuguese had landed on the beach on July 1st of that fateful year, burned the place to the ground, including the mosque and the palace, and after having heaped all this death and destruction, they retreated back to their boats and waited for the inevitable surrender. And that's where we'll pick up today in the 16th century, still the Ming Dynasty in China, and this began a new chapter in the history of the region. The Hindu, Buddhist regional influence had by now been replaced with Muslim religion and culture. Following the fall of the Sultanate of Malacca, the ruler, Mahmud Shah, and his successors took every possible swipe at the Portuguese that they could, and from their new base at the upper reaches of the Johor River, founded in 1528, the new Sultanate began its history. When the Portuguese captured Malacca, they only took possession of the real estate. But what made Malacca great were the people who called on this port to buy, sell, study Islam, or provide necessary trade services. They, by and large, stuck with the Sultan, and a massive block of trade volume shifted south to Johor, as well as to Aceh at the top of northern Sumatra. Malacca saw a degradation in its fortunes as a port of trade, and it didn't fade away like Temasek did in 1398, but their golden age had come and gone. Over in China, the imperial court of the Ming Emperor Zhengde wasn't too thrilled to see their ally in that part of the world, Malacca, defeated by the Portuguese. You recall from last episode how Admiral Zheng made the port one of China's clients in the area, and after manhandling their ally, Portugal was looked at as an antagonist in the region, and this much diminished their esteem with the Ming Dynasty officials. During these decades of the 16th century, there was no small amount of angry back and forth between the Ming court and the Portuguese, and all of this eventually culminated in a 1554 peace treaty that led to the 1557 informal cession of Macau to Portugal. It wasn't a legally binding transfer of sovereignty. It only allowed for the Portuguese to establish a permanent settlement there, something they had been pounding on the Chinese door to get. On the other side of the Johor Strait, on the island of Singapore, there lived mostly Orang Laut people, warriors among them. Sultan Alauddin, ruler of the Johor Sultanate from 1597 to 1615, maintained friendly relations with these indigenous people of the region. He saw the potential value of Singapore to the Sultanate, where the northeast of the island met the Johor River. Thanks to its proximity to Johor, Singapore's fortunes, for the first time since 1398, were on the uptick. Once again, as a gateway to the South China Sea, more traders were engaging in commerce there. Any merchant vessel sailing east from Malacca or Sumatra or anywhere in the Bay of Bengal had to pass through the Singapore Strait. As a port of trade, the Lion City was back in business, not as a major port, but an important node along a trading network more than 1,000 years old. The Portuguese had sailed down there on a punitive expedition against the unfriendly Orang Laut, trying to tamp them down as a potential troublemaker. They had considered building a fort on Singapore during the 1570s, but that didn't happen. The Sultanate of Johor became the successor to the Melaka Sultanate. Because they had been able to attract so many of the established traders to come to their part of the peninsula, their rise, starting in the 1580s and 90s, came at Portuguese Malacca's expense. As the 1600s dawned, the merchant fleets of European corporations began to replace nation-states. The newly established Dutch East India Company, or VOC, had 3 ships anchored at the mouth of the Singapore River. And one morning on February 25th, 1603, they awoke to find a massive Portuguese ship named the Santa Catarina, laden with a full load of treasure, slaves, soldiers, women, and children. The cargo hold was stuffed to the gills with goods purchased in China and Japan. The value of all the captured cargo in European markets was shockingly high. They snatched the vessel and sailed all the booty back to Europe. Although the Portuguese were the first Europeans to sail to and trade in Asia, the Dutch will make fast work of them in the 17th century. After the Santa Catarina incident, the Dutch handed the Portuguese their heads on the high seas, inflicting so much damage and loss of commercial goods. It spelled the beginning of the end for them as the greatest power in that part of the world. After deciding they were here to stay, the Dutch combed the region for a base of operations, settling on Batavia in 1619, and this today is the city of Jakarta. To complement this base on the island of Java, the Dutch VOC moved swiftly to establish trading settlements or ports throughout the islands of Indonesia and the Malacca Strait. In January 1641, they would team up with the Sultan of Johor to kick the Portuguese out of their last bastion of trade, this being Malacca. But when they went down to the Philippines, Lady Luck was not on their side, and they had to beat a hasty retreat. And a lot of this was discussed in the History of Taiwan series. As you recall, later on in the 17th century, early in the Qing dynasty, they set up Fort Zeelandia in the city of Tainan. Preceding the Dutch VOC by 3 years came the British East India Company, a firm known by several names and nicknames. The French as well. They also threw their hat into the ring with their French Compagnie des Indes. The 17th century marked the beginning of these joint stock companies commencing their profitable reigns of terror over their respective spheres of influence in Asia. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but, in our day, it's come in for some criticism. The EIC had established a toehold in Indonesia at the port of Bencoolen, today's western Sumatran city of Bengkulu. This was as close as they could get to all the substantial action going on in the Malacca and Singapore Straits. With England now plying these waters, this put an end to Spain and Portugal's perfect little world. Since the end of the 15th century, they had enjoyed a nice monopoly on East and Southeast Asian trade. It was good while it lasted. In 1565, Spain had set up their colony in the Philippines and did a masterful job converting the local people to the one true faith. But as far as the Portuguese, they had an abysmal time trying to force Catholicism on the Muslim faithful. Around this time, there was a brief mention about Singapore written by a Flemish gem trader named Jacques de Cout. He traveled this part of Asia between 1594 and 1625 and described his journey throughout the Singapore and the Malacca Straits, and he made all kinds of observations of the region that were recorded in his book. and his descriptions of the sea lanes and ports between Malacca and Siam present seas that were bustling with substantial maritime trade. Among Decoud's observations concerned the island of Sentosa, a few miles off the coast of Singapore. He wrote, quote, "In the Strait of Singapore, in the middle of the said two straits, there is an island called Sentosa, which on one side features the new strait, and on the other the old strait. The island is triangular in shape. Your Majesty should mandate the construction of a castle or fortress on this island and equip it with good pieces of artillery. These two straits are well frequented, and no ship or vessel can pass through them without us being able to sink them. The tip of this island is a natural fortress, and the aforementioned point is a rock. With little cost, it would be possible to construct this fortress. The island features thick foliage with large trees, and there is much fresh water. This castle would be of great effect and protection of the ships from China, both for those coming from or going to. Our ships would be safe at anchorage below this castle." End quote. Regarding the local Orang Laut, he wrote, quote, "There are many fishermen called Orang Laut in this Strait of Singapore. They are local people. They are Malays. If one accompanies and pays them, they will serve well. These Orang Laut visit all the islands around these straits, and where there are enemies, they come to warn us in exchange for a piece of cloth worth 4 reals, which they are given, and for them to remain under our protection. On entering the old strait, they came on board with fresh fish and many local fruits, which are so different from the ones in Europe and which they pick in the hills. One of the fruits is called durian, the others being mangosteens and rambutans. They taste really good and are healthy to eat. These fishermen also brought us fresh water. We obtained all these things by bartering rice and old blankets. These Orang Laut are really poor people. They live on narrow boats that measure at the most 4 to 5 meters and which are constructed of light, thin planks. They live in these with their wives, children, dogs, and cats. In this little boat, they even keep roosters with their hens. I was truly amazed to see that they all fitted into such a restricted space. When they fish, they stand at the front of the boat, holding a harpoon, while the wife and children paddle fast and furious. Among them, there are some people who get very old. I got to know some of them who claimed to be 100 years old. They are by nature treacherous people, and so we had to be very careful when dealing with them, and we always had to carry arms in hand, for it has happened that, when they came to sell fish, a great number of them were carelessly admitted aboard, and then they became very hostile and massacred everyone on board. They carry as weapons poisoned daggers, which they call creases." End quote. In 1703 came one of the more anecdotal stories from Singapore history. This involved an offer made by the Sultan of Johor at that time, Abdul Jamil IV, involving the sale of the entire island of Singapore. The offer was made to an English country trader named Alexander Hamilton, not the Hamilton on the $10 bill. He had written about the Sultan, quote, "I called at Johor on my way to China, and he treated me very kindly and made me a present of the island of Singapore. But I told him it could be of no use to a private person, though a proper place for a company to settle a colony on, lying in the center of trade, being accommodated with good rivers and safe harbors, so conveniently situated that all winds serve shipping both to go out and come into these rivers." End quote. When given a tour of the island, Hamilton had remarked that the place appeared uninhabited. It was a nice offer, but not so practical for someone with limited capital or resources. When Hamilton got to tour Singapore, the island had more or less reverted back to its natural green state of an island jungle. He wrote everything down in a travel book entitled A New Account of the East Indies, published in 1727. This one joined a gaggle of other similar books written in many languages that passed down to us detailed accounts of their travels through the regions they visited, and these descriptions all gave us insight and texture to the local customs, trade practices, and political situations throughout the region. With the Dutch focusing on their new base on the island of Java, they cared less about their peninsular Malaysia routes. With such a plum location right where the Sunda Strait was, Malacca's importance was rather diminished. As for the British, after 1757 and the victory of Robert Clive at the Battle of Plassey, their attention was focused on developing India. And they famously ended up on the receiving end of tax collection for all of Bengal. Not far from there, in Bihar State, was one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world, Patna. And there, the EIC grew and processed their number one cash crop, opium, and shipped it to China, where the proceeds were used to purchase tea and other manufactures. This added further fuel to the opium crisis that hit China hard beginning in the 1770s. As soon as the Jia Qing emperor finally got to sit on the throne, occupied by his long-reigning father, Qianlong, he at once banned opium imports into China. Well, a lot of good that did, as his second son will find out when he becomes the new emperor in 1820. It was one thing to ban it, and a whole other kettle of fish to enforce it, and I'm sure the DEA would agree with me on that point. For the time being, all the tea heading to Europe and the opium heading in the other direction to China passed through the Malacca and Singapore Straits. Into the 1780s came another Anglo-Dutch war, followed by the rise of Napoleon. Now, I don't want to get sucked into all the wars on the continent. Let me just say that the Napoleonic Wars contributed mightily to Dutch decline in Asia. In 1794, France declared war on Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, and in the winter of that year, the French captured the Dutch fleet and then headed straight for Amsterdam. And due to this strange geopolitical dynamic, the Dutch and the English found themselves in the same bed together with a common foe, that being La France. As we have seen thus far, the Dutch had been dominating trade in the Southeast Asian region. Prior to the headaches Napoleon was giving them, the Dutch had booted the Bugis out of Johor leadership and had essentially turned the Johor Riau Sultanate into a kind of vassal state. Between what they had going on in Indonesia and also in Malaysia, they had a good thing going, and now their regional dominance was in jeopardy. The Bugis, by the way, were a warlike people who came from Sulawesi in the wake of the Makassar War of 1666 and 69, and had migrated west to the Malay Peninsula and Riau, as I mentioned, located on the east coast of Sumatra on the other side of the Malacca Strait from Malacca and Singapore. The Bugis had muscled their way into the Johor Riau Sultanate and, through their hereditary title of Raja Muda, served as underkings who played an oversized role in Sultanate political affairs. They had been able to push the Orang Laut aside from any role in government. The Bugis were also a legendary trading people who were primarily responsible for turning Johor Riau into the trade emporium it had become. Anyway, into the 1790s, after a bad luck streak for the Netherlands, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, ended with a whimper. After a most profitable and blood-soaked 200-year run, they were shuttered in 1799, and henceforth the Dutch government took over control of the colonies. At the same time, the turn of the century, Napoleon, like the 1998 French football team, was proving to be unstoppable on the battlefield. In 1802, he sent his brother, Louis Napoleon, to rule the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic became the Kingdom of Holland, a vassal of the French Empire. The Napoleonic Wars turned the Netherlands into a French client state, and this made their possessions in Southeast Asia fair game for the British. After Napoleon did what he did to them, neither the Dutch nor the British wanted the French Republic to take over those plum Southeast Asian territories. So in late January, early February, as per the coup letters signed by William V, Prince of Orange, the British occupied Malacca and other Dutch territories as trustees until this tempest ended, which it did in 1815. In 1811, the jewel of the Dutch colonial crown, the island of Java, came under British administration. Now, hold that thought until we come back to it in a bit when I introduce Sir Stamford Raffles. He has a role to play in this. Now, following the defeat of Napoleon, and especially in the wake of the Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805, the British were now fully energized and fortified with all the inventions and innovations of the Industrial Revolution. They came out of the Napoleonic Wars smelling like a rose. All of this had a direct impact on the founding of Singapore in 1819. So let's start setting all that up. With the Industrial Revolution running at full bore, all of these mechanical devices needed a supply chain of raw materials to convert into finished products. That's where these colonies really came in handy. Now there was no need to deal with middlemen or exporters always trying to get a piece of your pie. Britannia now ruled the waves, and their naval power was the linchpin that allowed them to project power like they were able to. By 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, the era of Pax Britannica began, and Britain enjoyed the role of becoming the leading global hegemonic power until World War I. It was a great time in Britain, maybe not so much for the native people living in their colonies, but for young British men, this whole dynamic opened up limitless career possibilities, and into this world emerged Thomas Stamford Bingley Raffles. So let's introduce his early life and how he ended up carving out his place in Singapore's history. There are differing opinions about Raffles and his achievements in the founding of Singapore and his impact on what the island eventually became. At the outset in Part 1, I mentioned something about how many believe Singapore history only started in 1819 with Raffles, and that everything that followed into the 18th and 19th century was all due to him and his successors. There's a plaque located right at Boat Quay on the Singapore River that reads, quote, "On this historic site, Sir Stamford Raffles first landed on 28th of January, 1819, and with genius and perception changed the destiny of an obscure fishing village to a great seaport and modern metropolis." End quote. However you look at the situation, few names evoke an image of Singapore more than Sir Stamford Raffles. The Raffles Hotel, Raffles City, Raffles Place, the Raffles Institution, Raffles Junior College, Raffles Hospital, Raffles Marina, Raffles Lighthouse, Raffles Class on Singapore Airlines. Well, now it's just called business class, but it used to be branded as Raffles Class. He practically had the monopoly as far as the one name most associated with the founding of Singapore. Thomas Stamford Raffles was born July 5th, 1781, same birthday as P.T. Barnum. He didn't come from money. His father was a merchant sea captain who abandoned the family and later died in a debtor's prison in 1811. Raffles' path to Singapore began in 1795, all of 14 years old, when he started working at East India House, the company's London head office. By age 19, in 1800, he was still working there as a junior clerk. And after putting in 10 years with the company, in 1805, his big break fell out of the sky, and he took a position in Penang to serve as the assistant secretary to the governor. In 1790, Francis Light, a former Royal Navy officer, had persuaded the Sultan of Kedah to hand them the island of Penang at the western end of the Malacca Strait. All the EIC had to pay was $6,000 per year rent, and the settlement they built was named Georgetown. It's still there, though not a British settlement anymore. One thing about Stamford Raffles, although he didn't attend the most prestigious schools growing up, he was one of those self-taught kind of geniuses. On his voyage over to Penang back in 1805, in addition to reading the Sejarah Melayu, the Malay Annals, he taught himself Bahasa Melayu and was able to communicate directly with the Malay people. He was well-read about all aspects of the region and was familiar with Southeast Asian history, including the history of Temasek and Singapura, as well as what followed its demise. Now, back to 1811. When the British assumed administration of this Indonesian Dutch colony, Batavia, Raffles was the one posted from Penang to Java to serve as lieutenant governor. To make a long story short, one thing most historians agree on was that Stamford Raffles, he was a romanticist. He had big ideas and grand visions of what he believed was best for the EIC and for Great Britain. Well, it's one thing to have ideas. Implementing them successfully is another thing. During his 4 years in charge of affairs on the island of Java, he didn't have much to show for his efforts. He burned through a lot of money and tried to get some things done, but under his lackluster watch, there was little to show for. And besides this, Raffles also presided over quite a bit of pillaging and looting that went on. The Sultanate of Yogyakarta was one ruler on the south side of Java who resisted British efforts to control them. And Raffles didn't like that. So, in response to this resistance, in June 1815, same month Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, on Maka's birthday no less, Raffles asserted British authority over the Sultanate and attacked. The Kraton, or Royal Palace of Yogyakarta, well, it wasn't leveled, but it was demolished. Though not as well known as the 1860 sacking of the Summer Palace in Beijing, at least with the Indonesian people, this was a dark day in their history. The man who led the assault on the Yogyakarta Palace, preceding Lord Elgin by 45 years, was named John Crawford. Remember that name, as he'll be one of the stars of Part 3 of this series. The Sultan was captured and exiled. Then, like any authoritarian regime does, the British installed a more colonial-friendly ruler to govern Yogyakarta the way they wanted. That wasn't why Raffles was recalled, but from a profitability standpoint at least, he didn't get high marks for his achievements for the years he served in Java. One other interesting note was that, thanks to Raffles' patronage whilst on Java, after hearing rumors of the existence of some massive temple complex that had been consumed by the jungle, in 1814 he sent someone qualified in Javan antiquity to go investigate. And after a gargantuan effort to slash through the jungle, the famous 9th century Borobudur Buddhist temple complex was discovered. Raffles never saw it for himself, but he was chiefly responsible for putting things in motion that led to its eventual discovery. In March 1816, after his dismissal, Raffles returned home to try and clear his name, mansplain all the money-losing programs he attempted to implement on Java, and try to restart his career. On his voyage back to Blighty, he stopped off at the EIC island of St. Helena, 1,210 miles west of the southwest African coast and about 2,500 miles east of Rio, in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. He must have caught Napoleon on a bad day, as the encounter was anything but pleasant. The former French emperor had been reduced to being an elephant man-type figure who others enjoyed gawking at. So extraordinarily knowledgeable was Raffles. While he didn't do any great things for the EIC there, he did write a 2-volume magnum opus called The History of Java. You could download a copy from archive.org. I have both volumes tucked away in a folder. I hope I live long enough to peruse one day. The work was quite celebrated in its time and portrayed Raffles as this gallant adventurer, explorer, and scholar. He dedicated the work to the Prince Regent, George, Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, regent to his father, the so-called Mad King, George III. And for such a clever move as dedicating his book to His Royal Highness, it actually led to a knighthood at Carlton House for Raffles on May 20th, 1817, during this period of home leave in England. Thanks to his History of Java, he not only became Sir Stamford Raffles, he also got to add the respectable 3 letters after his name, FRS, Fellow of the Royal Society, and the best was yet to come. In March 1818, Raffles was reassigned to Bencoolen, where he served as lieutenant governor. Even after all this time, it was still a colonial backwater over on the west coast of Sumatra, facing the Indian Ocean. Despite the dismal state of Bencoolen, for a British colonial that is, He went about spiffing the place up and made a go at trying to make something of it. The British always had big plans as far as developing Bencoolen, but it never amounted to much and always operated at a loss for the company. The EIC only held on to Bencoolen because, as a Sumatran outpost, it was better than nothing. As for Raffles, he couldn't have been happy being assigned to a comparative backwater as Bencoolen. His career with the company, despite his knighthood, wasn't going how he had hoped. One thing he strongly advocated for was a better place than the west coast of Sumatra for the British to establish themselves. Now was the perfect time, when the Dutch were on their back foot. Their situation in Southeast Asia was a far cry from what it had once been in the 16 and 1700s. The British needed to strike fast while the Dutch were distracted with problems back home and in trying to claw back power in the region. Raffles, and others as well, knew that without a base in the middle of all the action, sailing through the Malacca and Singapore Straits, they'd always be at the mercy of Dutch ports for their repairs and resupply. Not an enviable position to be in. And the Dutch used their strategic position to put whatever stumbling blocks they could to British traders calling on ports they controlled or influenced. Bencoolen was nice, but it was on the wrong side of Sumatra. They needed to be at or near the Malacca Strait. There were two main routes for ships to sail between India and China. Both of them had to pass alongside Sumatra. One could sail through the Sunda Strait between Sumatra and Java, or through the Malacca Strait. And the Dutch controlled both. This is where Francis Rawdon Hastings, 1st Marquess of Hastings, enters our picture. He led troops in not only the Revolutionary War, but in the Napoleonic Wars as well. In 1812, he took up the post of Governor-General of India and Commander-in-Chief. He had actually been the one who called for Raffles' dismissal from Java. But when they met again in October 1818, Lord Hastings held him in higher esteem. Raffles had come to India to discuss an urgent matter that required bold and decisive action. Ever since the Convention of London signed between the Dutch and the British on August 13, 1814, the Dutch had regained control over most of their colonies that had been occupied by the British during the Napoleonic Wars. This also included ceding the South African Cape Colony to the Brits. So with everything more or less put back together again, as it had been before Napoleon, and with China trade booming like never before in history, without this safe harbor they were pining for, the British were in a rather disadvantageous position. Raffles had visited Malacca twice during the period of British trusteeship, and he knew firsthand the criticality of a port in these waters. Penang was too far north, at the top of the Malacca Strait, and Bencoolen, again, as far as EIC captains and other country traders were concerned, wrong side of Sumatra. So at this fateful meeting in Calcutta with Lord Hastings, Raffles pleaded his case. The urgency to act was further intensified upon hearing the alarming news that the Dutch, in November 1818, had renewed their 1784 treaty with the Sultan of Johor and began building fortifications to secure their position there. Ever since coming to the aid of the Sultan against his Bugis antagonizers inside the Sultanate, by signing and now renewing this 1784 treaty, the Sultan had essentially surrendered a degree of sovereignty to the Dutch. The British East India Company higher-ups never expected the Dutch to bounce back so fast. They badly miscalculated. Some of you might remember it was also around this time that the Dutch sailed to the west coast of Borneo in West Kalimantan at Pontianak and planted some roots there. This was all mentioned in that two-part CHP series on the Hakka Gongsis of Borneo, CHP episodes 278 and 79, if you want to check those out. Raffles didn't have to twist Lord Hastings' arm to get him to agree to the idea of securing a port in either the Malacca or Singapore Strait that the EIC, and by extension Great Britain, could call their own. Ideally, the location would be as close as possible to the southern tip of the Malaysian Peninsula, or as Hastings instructed, a location that would secure the Malacca Strait. There were three men in on this idea. Two I've mentioned already, Lord Hastings and Stamford Raffles. There was a third figure I'd like to introduce here who was also sympathetic to this idea. This was William Farquhar. He was a Scotsman who, as a cadet at 20 years of age in 1790, served with the Madras engineers in India against the Sultan of Mysore, as well as against the French in southern India. Farquhar also served as chief engineer in the expeditionary force that seized Malacca from the Dutch in 1795. And he continued to serve there and rose up the ranks, becoming British resident there in 1803 until the place was handed back to the Dutch in 1818. So well did Farquhar manage the place, and in such high esteem did the locals and foreign traders hold him, he acquired the title of Raja of Malacca. He was fluent in Malay and had a French Malay mistress who he fathered 6 children with. And one little trivial morsel for you. The progeny of one of Farquhar's daughters from this marriage is the ancestor of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, or so said an article from the Straits Times in 2018. Though he received no small amount of criticism from British detractors who found his embrace of Malay culture inappropriate and distasteful, no one could refute he was a first-class administrator and was good at his job. But Farquhar's pragmatic and often sympathetic management of the local Malays was pointed to by his detractors in order to pour whatever scorn they had on his style. Yeah, going native and or showing a high degree of interest and appreciation of the local people and their culture, though not against the law, wasn't exactly encouraged either. So all three men, Hastings, Raffles, and Farquhar, were in agreement that an EIC outpost was essential and that there was no better time than the present to sail up to those waters, look around for an island that was not yet under Dutch control, and plant the flag there. They'd do the same thing again in 1842 in Hong Kong following the end of the First Opium War. They were going to acquire that Brit-friendly port or die trying. So Raffles found Hastings was an easy sell as far as this idea went, and both were in lockstep regarding the importance of not delaying any further. By waiting, it would allow all these post-London Convention Dutch gains to consolidate and fortify them in their dominance within these seas. Lord Hastings, in his instructions dated November 28, 1818, granted Raffles limited jurisdiction to settle on a suitable port that would serve all the needs of the company and Britain in those waters, as they had discussed them in Calcutta. Just one red line, Lord Hastings said, should not be crossed, and that was not to antagonize the Dutch by choosing a location that was already under their control. And that gave Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar a ton of wiggle room to settle on a location. If there was one thing you could say about Raffles, it was that if you opened the door just a crack, he'd find a way to drive a 40-foot high-cube container through the opening if you let him. And so the mission began. On December 7th, 1818, Raffles and Farquhar set sail from Calcutta in the direction of the Riau archipelago. Raffles sailed at the head of a flotilla of ships flying the East India flag, and to show he meant business, on board were 120 Bengal Army soldiers. Singapore, it wasn't the first choice, but it was definitely on the list. Most of the choice locations were already in the back pocket of the Dutch. They had moved quickly to restore the hegemonic position they enjoyed before Napoleon Bonaparte ruined everything, and they had worked things out with all the political authorities to not cooperate with the British, if or when their ships came calling. On December 29th, Raffles and Farquhar arrived in Penang, only to hear about the treaty between the Dutch and the Sultan being renewed. Now their mission was even more urgent. The governor, or chief resident of Penang, John Bannerman, was not supportive at all of this mission. Whether he believed it would open up a can of worms with the Dutch or it would undercut his importance up in Penang, It can only be speculated. Historians seem to agree it was the latter rather than the former. Both Raffles and Farquhar left Penang on separate vessels, departing January 18th and January 26th, respectively, and this was in the year 1819. They rendezvoused at Karimun Island first, right at the intersection of the Malacca and Singapore Straits, just to the west of Singapore. Great location, but after surveying the island, they concluded it wasn't any good. There was no deepwater harbor suitable enough for the purposes they needed it for. You know, it took a long time back in the day to send communications back and forth. The British Foreign Office received Lord Hastings' information concerning the mission Raffles and Farquhar were on, and that sent alarm bells ringing in Whitehall and Leadenhall Street. Both officials in the government and the EIC Home Office tried to quash the mission out of fear of pissing off the Dutch at such a fragile time in diplomatic relations. But by the time that order came, it was already a fait accompli. 8 days later, after concluding Karimun was unsuitable, on January 28, 1819, at 4 in the afternoon, they dropped anchor off St. John's Island, just to the south of Sentosa Island. This is where the Temenggong Abdul Rahman and the Sultan Hussein Shah enter our story. Raffles and Farquhar didn't know it at the time, but they were walking around lucky. They couldn't have picked a more perfect time to pull off the caper they did. Our story shifts to what can be called the second founding of Singapore. We already discussed the first founding of Singapore, Temasek and the 5 kings of Singapura that came to an end in 1398. Unbeknownst to Raffles and Farquhar, there was a serious power struggle that was going down in the Johor Sultanate, of which Singapore was part of. In the old Malay and also Javanese ruling structure, a Temenggong was a high-ranking noble, 2 notches down from the Sultan, who served as a kind of Minister of State Security or Defense Minister. So this Temenggong Abdul Rahman, he was serving in this position when he came out on the losing side of a power struggle at the top of the Sultanate. The spark that ignited the fuse that set things in motion happened in 1812 when the Sultan, Mahmud Shah, died. The Crown Prince Hussein, he was out of town getting married when this happened, and the Bugis faction at the Sultan's court, led by their highest-ranking person inside the Sultanate, the Raja Muda, then based in Riau, had Hussein's younger half-brother in mind as their candidate for the new Sultan. The Bugis operatives in the Sultanate were able to prevail in this struggle, and their man, also named Abdul Rahman, became the new ruler. So having been marginalized by the Bugis and the government, and with his authority undermined, the Temenggong, in 1811, vacated the Sultanate and set up a new, autonomous base on the island of Singapore. Hundreds or thousands of his followers and supporters, depending on the text you read, joined him there. Crown Prince Hussein left the Sultanate and went into exile, waiting things out. The Temenggong set himself up in Kampong Glam in what is today Singapore Center. Kampong Glam is bounded on 4 sides by Victoria Street, Rochar Road, Beach Road, and Ophir Road. The Sultan Mosque, Haji Lane, Arab Street are all there. As he began to administer the place and restore it to its former importance, Temenggong Abdul Rahman also sent out the call to Chinese farmers and settlers in Riau across the Malacca Strait, and he let them know that they were welcome to cultivate and process their gambier and pepper in Singapore. And a lot of these earliest of Chinese to settle in Singapore took the Temenggong up on his word and migrated there to roll the dice and work their plantations there. Over time, the Temenggong continued to consolidate his position in Singapore, and he administered it completely separate from what the Dutch had going on in the Johor Sultanate. He didn't break from the Sultanate, but he had his own thing going on down there. So when Raffles and Farquhar dropped anchor off the coast of Singapore, they were walking into a political kerfuffle that opened the door for them to play an opportunistic role as colonial powers are wont to do, and at the same time achieve their objective of a port at the bottom of the Malacca Strait, just like Hastings instructed. Temenggong Abdul Rahman saw the vessels anchored offshore. Well, you didn't see that every day. And from his perch on the island of Singapore, he probably had an idea what this was all about. Hussein, or Hussein Shah, the ruler of Singapore, wasn't around, so it fell to the Temenggong himself to welcome these East India Company visitors. When a messenger was sent to inquire about the presence of any Dutch on the island, they were assured, no Dutch here. The party was invited to come ashore. The more Raffles and Farquhar studied the waters, the depth of the harbor, and marveled at its perfect location, they both knew this was the place. Lord Hastings had clearly warned them, don't do anything to agitate the Dutch authorities. That was the red line. Anything except that was okay. The Temenggong had assured them, while technically, the island was under the jurisdiction of the Johor Sultanate, but he called the shots here, and the half-brother to the Sultan, Hussein Shah, was the autonomous Sultan of Singapore. Raffles and Farquhar both pondered how far to take this whole thing. After becoming familiar with the political situation regarding the Temenggong and Hussein Shah, and how 8 years before the Bugis and the Dutch worked in cahoots to usurp the Sultan's throne, they saw an obvious quid pro quo that could be worked out to the benefit of both sides, especially theirs. When Hussein Shah returned and all four men sat together inside the tent, they agreed to sign an agreement whereby the British East India Company would recognize Hussein as the rightful Sultan of Singapore. And in return, Hussein Shah would greenlight the permission for Raffles and Farquhar to establish a trading post on the island. And when I say trading post, they weren't thinking about what you see today landing at Changi Airport. It was a small plot of land. Raffles and Farquhar weren't getting sovereignty or anything beyond this patch of land to use as their base in the region. And this vague agreement marked the humble beginning of modern Singapore. Raffles, he was banking on the Dutch, maybe giving a snort or two and maybe stamping their feet a little, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. He put his chips on the riskier bet to see how things played out. After all, the document that sealed the deal indicated there was no permanent settlement and not 1 ounce of sovereignty whatsoever. They might grumble, but the Dutch won't say anything. As a sweetener, Raffles had originally offered the Temenggong an annual stipend of 3,000 Spanish dollars. And then when Sultan Hussein Shah appeared on the scene shortly thereafter, this preliminary agreement signed with the Temenggong was made official with the same terms, but with an additional annual stipend of 5,000 Spanish dollars for the Sultan. And that was about $100,000 back then. At that time, when they signed that agreement on February 6th, 1819, and raised the British flag for the first time, there were maybe around 1,000 or so inhabitants living in Singapore, mostly Orang Laut, followed by Malay and Chinese. Then, with that out of the way, Raffles gave very strict instructions to Farquhar regarding how he should proceed and what his vision was for the future and how to do this and that and what was strictly forbidden. And then the very next day, he took off for his post in Bencoolen, leaving William Farquhar in charge as first resident. Raffles had told him straight out the whole Singapore thing wasn't going to be funded by anyone. He had to use his noggin to try and figure out how to get that place up and running out of essentially almost nothing, save for that primo location at the center of all the action. If Farquhar thought that, at least he could raise some revenue from port taxes and duties, Raffles had another thing in mind. Raffles knew that they had to offer something special to attract these trading vessels from the Red Sea to the South China Sea. So from day one, Singapore operated as a free port. The goods they traded in weren't subject to duties. And as Raffles sailed away, that was Farquhar's dilemma. Raffles was operating Bencoolen at a loss, and he didn't want to put any further financial strain on the company. And he was still smarting from his experience in Java back in 1811. That made him look bad. Therefore, this whole matter of funding for Singapore was Farquhar's headache. Well, I thought we'd get to at least 1824 this time, but not even close. Let's draw the curtains and turn out the lights for now, and we'll pick up in part 3 with the very capable and experienced William Farquhar in charge as the first resident of Singapore. There's still a long way to go yet before we come to our times in the 21st century, so I hope you'll consider coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.